Version 1.3 was a critical moment for Honkai Star's character design. Not only were the two 5-star characters a welcome addition to the roster in that one was, at the time, the single most valuable character in the game, and the other was also, at the time, the single most powerful DPS character in the game, but who the other one was, a character we knew all too well up until that point who carried a deeper connection to the Shinjo than he was letting on. Dan Heng, a version 1 4-star character and one of our starting units, was one of the two featured 5 stars of version 1.3, showcasing his Heng Imbibitor Lunae version. Alongside his two fellow quintets, Jingliu and Blade, Lunae Dan Heng ushered in the era of the destruction meta, dominating all of the DPS characters throughout the remainder of version 1, where he was considered the strongest of the three, albeit Jingliu was always seen as the more accessible one. Since his release, however, Dan Heng's presence in the metagame began to steadily decline, where he not only lost his position in the apex tiers, but continued to descend further and further down the ranks, to where he's almost borderline mid-tier if you average out his placements across the 3 game modes. Despite having gotten more support throughout version 2, his popularity continues to decline, being one of the least used characters in all 3 game modes, where he sits even lower than units who were expressly not meant for those game modes. For today's episode of Why No One Plays, we'll be discussing Lunae Dan Heng, documenting his descent from the number 1 DPS in Honkai Star. Before we talk about the video though, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor for today, Corepunk. They're having an early access promotion at the moment, so if you're interested in getting in on this early, now's a good time to do so. Corepunk's an isometric open-world MMO that combines aspects of MMOs, MOBAs, and action RPGs with a very punk aesthetic to it, if it wasn't obvious by the name. The game's built around an open world with character progression emulating MMOs, while at the same time having a MOBA-style experience to it that you can tap into for both PvE and PvP game modes. In essence, the overall gameplay is open-world MMORPG, so you got your usual skill trees, leveling system, equipment crafting, and whatnot, while the combat is based on a MOBA template, complemented by the expected fog of war and strategy aspects you tend to find in one. Also, for you lore enjoyers out there, Corepunk's story is delivered in a seasonal format with each episode featuring a standalone plot, so there's an overarching narrative to look forward to. Now, I know we all like to meme on League for being a spaghetti code mess. The developers of Corepunk, however, expressed a strong interest in rigorous balancing, quality of life improvements, and developments based on player feedback, with an aim to make a more community-centric game. So once again, if you're looking for something fresh to try out, check out their early access by using the link on screen or in the description below. One more time, the game is still early access, but they are working to perfect it as much as they can. Thanks again to Corepunk for sponsoring the video, but for now, let's get back on topic. What made his introduction so impactful in 1.3 was not just that we received a powerful general attacker, but also the fact that he was an alternative version of an existing character, someone who by all accounts is considered one of the worst units in the game. It was an indication that Hoyo was willing to make alts for Honkai Star's units, a theory that got proven right with the release of March 8, and then later Tingyun's Fugue ult, and of course Madame Herda. More exciting was that Lunae Dan Heng possessed a completely different path and element than his base version, and with entirely new abilities at that. His release was hotly anticipated by the community, emphasized by his drip marketing being the single most liked post on HSR's Twitter account until Sunday's announcement over a year later. Dan Heng's new power was truly staggering for the time he came out, and even for a long while after. When taking a look at the potential DPS output in his kit, the numbers far exceeded that of Seela, Blade, or Jingyuan's, along with him being a blast attacker, which offered the most practical coverage for the content we had available, though it was accompanied by a high price tag. Much like Blade, who came the version prior, Dan Heng's gimmick was basic attack empowerment, only instead of consuming a single point to augment himself for the next 3 turns, Dan Heng was a funnel where you could shuttle as much SP as you wanted to, up to a cap of 3 per use, to increase the strength of his basic attack. At full charge, the damage output was exquisite, dealing an incredible 500% to the primary target and then 180% to adjacent ones. The strongest single attack at the time, Seela's ultimate, did 425% and it was only to one enemy, meaning point for point, Dan Heng could theoretically do more damage than some ultimates. The caveat is that you have to expend 3 skill points per action to pull this off, making him arguably the most SP demanding character in Star Rail to this day. Before I say Qingque, that's not SP inefficiency, that's just a skill issue. Considering how much he could do though, even if you can only pull this off once every other turn, it was still sufficient at dishing out overwhelming damage. Conveniently for him, there was another way he could obtain free charges of his empowered basic attack without consuming SP. His ultimate. Dan Heng had a damaging ultimate that, while not quite as strong as a level 3 basic attack, was still an equally essential part of his game plan. Using it would grant him 2 stacks of Squalma Sacrosancta, which could be used in substitution of SP, and you were highly encouraged to do so courtesy of his passive. How it works is that Dan Heng's empowered basic attacks and ultimate deal X amount of hits. With each of those hits, he gains 10% bonus damage up to a cap of 6 times. Additionally, his skill also grants bonus crit damage based on the number of hits you apply with this empowered basic attack. So the general idea is that you want to maximize the number of hits you can do, which of course means getting as many level 3 basic attacks as you can. Done correctly, Dan Heng's DPS output far eclipsed what anyone was capable of doing. Trying to do so consistently was easier said than done though, a requirement that only became more necessary and challenging to maintain over time. Consistency is of greater significance than how strong you can get, and while technically Dan Heng's toolkit was constructed around alleviating the burden of SP consumption, the key word is alleviate, not cure, bringing us to the first reason why he's been falling off in recent times. Dan Heng's high maintenance is borderline impractical. It's at a point where the benefit you get from such investment isn't exactly worth the cost required to obtain it. At the time, yes, Dan Heng was doing several hundred thousands worth of damage per turn compared to most others who were barely struggling to break above the 6-figure mark, but when you fast forward to the modern day, dealing a 250,000 damage is actually on the lower side with how inflated DPS has become. Granted, with current infrastructure, Dan Heng should be doing damage upwards of 500,000, but the point still remains he's becoming extremely SP demanding in a metagame where teams are becoming progressively more SP friendly. Moreover, the damage he pumps out relative to the cost is getting overshadowed by too many sources. In other words, he got power crept in more ways than one. We've since gotten a couple supports who are not only SP economical, but even replenish SP for him to use, Sparkle being the first high-profile example of this. I know he had Hanya beforehand, but like I said, high-profile example. Sparkle was a huge quality of life boost to Dan Heng, not only supplementing the party with a ton of extra SP to use, but also increasing the SP cap of the party, letting him burst attack a lot more efficiently, and even rewarding him for doing so by making the party do more DPS based on how much SP is used. Sparkle effectively resolved all of Dan Heng's SP consumption issues, enabling him to use a max power basic attack every single action give or take when used in conjunction with his Squamma Sacrosancta. The problem though is that Dan Heng's SP consumption still remains a flaw that needs to be mended, whereas most other attackers simply don't have that problem to begin with. In spite of a support like Sparkle, it is and always will be a con. On that front, the need to funnel a combination of 3 SP and Sacrosancta to achieve its empowered basic attack forces you to be airtight with your rotations and team optimization, making him one of the few characters in the game that actively demand you to plan ahead multiple turns in advance to ensure that both Dan Heng and his supports have enough to do their respective jobs. In version 1, you could still out-damage other carries with a level 2 basic attack, which ironically made him one of the more flexible attackers in the game since you could decide just how much to commit to a certain enemy and conserve resources whenever possible. But against the competition we have now, it's level 3 or bust. Throughout the better part of version 2, his best team consisted of himself, Sparkle, Tingyun or Runmei, and then a sustain, typically Huohuo. This party could afford him both SP, buffs, and energy, which also could be seen as SP given his ultimate. It was a perfectly serviceable team. I would say currently his best team now would be himself, and then either Robin and Sparkle, Robin and Sunday, or Sparkle and Sunday. The difference between them is not that much. Although it should be stated that Sunday has to be E0S1 at least, or ideally E2S1. Finally, Huohuo, or if you plan to go no sustain then Tingyun, granting him even more SP, energy, and DPS. You could ultra boost Dan Heng to turn advance like a motherfucker and get level 3 basic attacks off on the regular. However, by the time he received a fully sufficient party, it was kind of too late. Every other combat engine, even the long neglected data engine, has become more efficient with the units we've obtained in version 2. As mentioned before, we've reached a point where teams are doing mid to high 6-figure damage on the regular, causing Dan Heng's originally high ceiling to go from a rarity to a common occurrence. The follow-up engine features multiple attackers who can all do good DPS, one of which in particular Dr. Ratio directly challenging Dan Heng in the same field of imaginary damage. Though he is a single target attacker and Dan Heng's a blast-oriented one, the focus is still on dealing concentrated damage to a single enemy, as Dan Heng isn't even close to doing enough AoE to be qualified as an AoE attacker. Ratio can do comparable damage to Dan Heng but without the SP cost requirement, and he comes with other quality of life things like being able to attack outside of his turn, automatically making him more flexible than Dan Heng. For that matter, Dan Heng's also a hyper carry, meaning he's more often than not the only person doing significant damage on his team. The idea is that he should be able to do enough to at least be on par with teams that have more than one source of DPS, but the reality is that he doesn't. He would be lucky to match Fei Xiao or Firefly's personal damage at that, but Fei Xiao isn't the only one kicking ass on her team. Topaz can also do some good damage, as well as even Aventurine. In break teams, Firefly might be doing a couple 100k per shot, but Fugue, Runmei, and your break sustain are also doing a couple 100k per shot. In contrast, it makes Dan Heng's DPS look impressive on paper, but not be all that amazing in application. That being said, having turn advances on his team makes it so he can take multiple turns in a single rotation compared to teams that don't have a turn advancer. But to do so, you need a hefty amount of investment to allow for that kind of party. Begging the question, is it even worth doing so when there are other options out there? In a similar fashion to Jingliu, Dan Heng's incompatibility with any of the central engines we have so far make it increasingly more challenging for players to find a reason to prioritize him over everyone else, especially considering the choices we have in the imaginary department. Ratio is given for free to all players who were around before 2.2, and use of the follow-up attack engine, the current strongest playstyle in the game, much easier to play and more accessible on account of being free. Over in Pure Fiction, firstly, Dan Heng's just not that good in that game mode whatsoever, and secondly, he's totally outclassed by Rappa. Or even if there's imaginary weakness on enemies, non-imaginary characters do better than Dan Heng in Pure Fiction. Fundamentally, he suffers from old school carry syndrome, where he was designed to be a self-contained attacker in a game where it honestly feels as if carries have to be designed around supports instead of the other way around. When a new DPS character comes out, you don't think to yourself what supports are best for them, you think to yourself what engine can they fit into. Also, if you really think about it, not a single attacker in version 2 doesn't belong to at least one archetype, barring Akron. Black Swan's damage over time, Boonhill and Firefly are both break, Yunli's follow-up attack, Fei Xiao's follow-up, Rappa is break. It's why Seala, Jingliu, Blade, and Lunae and Dan Heng are dropping off really quickly. With the sole exception of Blade's follow-up attack, none of them have any mechanic that allows them to synergize with any of the combat engines we have now. A character could have equal base power to Dan Heng, or even slightly less, and be significantly stronger than him just by adhering to an engine. I understand back in 1.3, 1.4, and so on there were no combat engines to begin with, so it's not necessarily Dan Heng's fault that he's just a regular attacker, but the truth of the matter is, we're going in that direction, and that will only make him less and less appealing when factoring opportunity cost. Speaking of opportunity cost, that's the other big thing holding Dan Heng back. He was constructed too specifically to where the only game mode he's compatible with is MOC. In Pure Fiction, despite being a blast attacker, Dan Heng's high SP consumption makes him ill-suited for endurance tests, of which Pure Fiction is one. You have to be able to clear wave after wave of enemies consistently and quickly. Even with support, Dan Heng simply doesn't have the gas to keep up, not compared to the AoE gods who shit out damage on all enemies like nobody's business. As for APOC, while APOC has been marketed as a boss-killing game mode with a focus on minimizing the number of turns you take, they also present a number of gimmicks that once again, Dan Heng isn't optimized for. Most APOC shadow bosses force you to kill the side enemies before you lay it on the big bad, and you're almost always required to break the boss's toughness gauge compared to MOC where you can just brute force your way through it. Conceptually speaking, Dan Heng is good in APOC Shadow, but he's just slightly too slow. In APOC Shadow, it's all about how fast you can break the boss, so you get the super boss. If you want to front load his damage, you're essentially forced to play a rushdown team, which is highly expensive for a result that's ultimately worse than what else we have available. To his credit, the inclusion of Sunday addressed most of his concerns with not being fast enough, but even then, it's still below what most people consider top tier in APOC Shadow. So let's recap what's pushing him down. Problem 1, Dan Heng's gluttonous SP consumption is and always will be a con. Even though we have units who can alleviate that, it's still worse than just not having that issue to begin with, because it's something you always have to play around. Anything you want to try, you have to account for the SP cost. It holds him back in Pure Fiction, where SP economy and AoE attacks are the be-all end-all, and it holds him back in APOC Shadow, where you have to be fast, especially at breaking. And to be fast, you need a ton of front-loaded SP and turn advancing, since Dan Heng is the only one honest team doing any DPS, whereas a follow-up and break team can attack with anyone at any time. Problem 2, Dan Heng's self-contained moveset makes him incompatible with any of the game's engines. Any support that can buff him only does so at a 1-to-1 conversion rate, which is bad for opportunity cost. For example, Sunday's a great partner for Dan Heng courtesy of battery, turn advance, multiple DPS buffs, and if you have E0S1, or even better, E2S1, he also gives a ton of SP, but you're completely missing out on the summon aspects, where Sunday really shines. Same applies to, say, Robin. Great buffer, but you don't get that many procs of her ultimate off, you don't give her that much energy, and your A4 passive is functionally non-existent. Sparkle is honestly the only one who is designed for the purposes of a hypercarry. Problem 3, Dan Heng's only strong in one game mode. In this day and age, you need to be good in no less than 2. All of the game's best attackers, Fei Xiao, Akron, Yunli, Firefly, Boonhill, Jinyu, and Rappa are in Apex tiers or higher in at least 2 game modes. Some are top tier in all 3 like Yunli and Akron, so when evaluating the economics of pulling for Dan Heng, he is far from the most optimal use of your jades. Units like Kurta and Himeko are considered top tier even though they don't pass that mark because they're comparatively more accessible. Dan Heng you have to go out of your way to pull for, but it's hard to make a case to pull for him when there are so many easier, more efficient, and flat out stronger units in the game, and that will only continue to be more so as time goes on. Essentially, he started out by having trouble with SP economy. That got fixed, but then he got screwed over by not being part of any combat engine. Then that sort of got fixed by him just doing a ton of damage, but then they made it so units are not just tested for their DPS ceiling, but also how endgame agnostic they are. It's been one thing after another for him. Pessimistic as it might sound, I think Dan Heng's days are numbered. If it's any comfort, it's not just him. Many version 1 units are failing to stand the test of time, and when combining that with growing HP inflation of endgame content, it's gonna be an uphill battle for him. That's not to say he's washed and you should no longer use him anymore, but I wouldn't be surprised if he continues to drop off entering version 3. We're about to get a new path and therefore likely combat engine, and then probably something else alongside that. Unless they make more supports like Sparkle where the more SP you consume, the stronger the whole party gets, that is the only way I see things working out for him. That and I guess a proper 4-piece relic set would be nice. What do you guys think about Dan Heng? Do you agree with my points or do you think I'm not giving him enough credit? Feel free to share in the comments. That's it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays videos if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.